Resuming debate?
Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Resuming Debate podcast. I'm your host, Member of Parliament, Garnet Jenness, and I've really enjoyed getting into podcasting, the depth of conversation that we're able to have. I try to bring depth and significance to my interventions in the House of Commons, but it's much harder when you have 30 seconds or 10 minutes compared to the opportunity in an hour to bring on thoughtful guests, to bring people from different party backgrounds with different kinds of life experience, and to bring you more color and context for the big issues that are being discussed in Canada. If you're a new listener, welcome to you. And if you're a longtime listener, welcome back. So many of you I know have been following the events in Iran, a country with an oppressive totalitarian government, where in spite of that, the people are showing incredible courage. And yes, it's in response to the murder of Mahsa Amini. Yes, it's about the restrictive rules that apply to women, but it's, I think, also about a broader revolutionary message that it's time for freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. It's time for political change, and I've been adding my voice, doing what I can from the Canadian Parliament on this. So I'm very pleased to have two incredible guests, both people that I've known and worked with in the past, of Iranian origin themselves, who are leaders here in Canada working on these issues. Sayeh Hassan is a lawyer and a human rights activist. Dr. Reza Moridi is a human rights activist as well, but also a former politician. He served as a Liberal MPP in the Ontario legislature. He's a Liberal, I'm a Conservative, and I don't know that we've ever found anything we disagree on. So it's great to have both of you on today. Sayeh, maybe I'll start with you. And I think for contextualizing this, of course, we're going to dig in a deep way into current events in Iran, but I think it would be great for people to hear your stories as well. So Sayeh, tell us a bit about your background, your family, coming to Canada, etc.
Okay, thank you so much for having me, Garnet, and thank you for being the voice of the Iranian people, bringing their voice to the parliament. That's been so appreciated in Iran and here as well. So thank you for that. My story, it started when I was 7. I was born in Iran right when the Iran and Iraq war started. My father was against the regime in Iran, the Islamic regime, and he was very vocal, but he wasn't part of any organization. He was just very unhappy with what was going on. And when I was 7, my parents decided that we were going to flee Iran because we could just no longer stay there. My father was being prosecuted. And my parents were also very concerned having me and my sister, having 2 daughters. They didn't want us to grow up in a country where there was no equality between men and women, and there was a lot of repression. And so we moved to Turkey, and we were there as refugees for 5 years until we were able to come to Canada almost 30 years ago now. So it's been quite a while. And I started my activism when I was about 20 years old, when I was in university. So that's 21 years ago, and that gives away my age. But when I was in Carleton University in Ottawa, I was very interested and involved with the human rights in Iran. And I saw that there wasn't really any student voices in Canada and in the universities. And my sister and I, we started a student club, an organization that dealt specifically with the human rights issues in Iran. And to the best of my knowledge, that was the first student organization that was ever created in Canada that dealt specifically with human rights. And over the years, I went to law school. I became a lawyer because I'm very passionate about the charter and the civil liberties that we have in Canada. And I continued with my activism through speaking at conferences, writing articles, speaking to politicians like yourself. That's how we met. I think it was 7 or 8 years ago. And others like James Bazan, who's also been just incredibly active in that area, in the area of human rights in Iran. And I've continued my work over the years, and I'm just incredibly humbled by and encouraged and hopeful by what I see in Iran right now, and the courage that I see from people in Iran right now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, and I look forward to digging more into those current events. But it's great to hear your story. And I wasn't going to ask your age, but you're someone who was born after the revolution started. Yeah. Reza, I hope I'm not telling any tales out of school here, but you're a little bit older than Sayeh here. So tell us a bit about your experience as well, and your journey to Canada.
Well, thank you very much, Garnet, for having me on your show, on your podcast. And I echo on what Sayeh has already said. Thank you, and also James Bazan and many of your colleagues at our Parliament, at the House of Commons, for your advocacy on behalf of the Iranian people, and also your activism for human rights in Iran in particular. So we are very grateful. It has been a great pleasure to get to know you. And I remember that one event, three of us actually organized at the Ontario legislature when I was the MPP over there, representing the people of Richmond Hill at the Ontario legislature. Well, my story is not very different than Sayeh's story, and not many different than almost 8 million Iranians now living out of Iran. They've been scattered in almost every country around the world. From mostly populated country such as the United States to very, very small, tiny island countries at the middle of South Pacific Ocean. That's where actually my wife, my family and I, when we left Iran in 1987, we went to Fiji Islands, which is an island country, small country with less than 1 million population. So we spent there for about 2.5 years. I was a professor at the university there. And from there, we moved to Canada in 1990. So it's now 32 years we have been living in Canada. In terms of birth, yes, I've been born several decades before the revolution. So when the revolution happened, I was a professor at one of the universities in Tehran, and also I was the dean of the School of Sciences over there. And I witnessed what happened in the universities, in academia. The regime, the Iranian regime, they shut down universities for 3 years. Can you imagine, in a country where we didn't have any university college for 3 years? And as they started shutting down the universities, they began purging academics from the universities. They purged God knows how many hundreds of professors, assistant professors, associate professors, academics from the universities. And one of them, of course, it was me. And I was lucky that only I was purged, but 2 of my colleagues, they have been executed by the regime. So it was very, very harsh environment. The regime created a very, very harsh environment, and that harsh environment has been continuing over the past 43 years as we speak now. So yes, it is very, it's very interesting from one point of view that to see that every Iranian, every one of those 8 millions living, as I said, in the small island countries up to European countries or North American countries, each of us, Garnet, we have our own story. And when you sit down with people and then they start, telling their story, their parents' story. But let us hope that the life of this regime will come to an end in the near future as we speak now. As you know, demonstrations and a revolution, in fact, is going on in Iran as we talk now. So yes, that is basically a bit of my life story since I came to this country, Canada. And when I came to Canada in 1990 with my family, I had only came with 4 suitcases, that's all. And a couple of university degrees and credentials in our suitcases. That's how we arrived in Canada. But then I started working, of course, as a scientist, and then entered into politics because I wanted to serve my country, Canada. I felt that this is the duty of the Iranian community to this wonderful country who opened its arms most warmly to people fleeing their country, Iran, and coming to this wonderful land. So I did that, and unfortunately, I was successful in 2007. I got reelected in 2011 and 2014, and I had the honor of serving in the Ontario cabinet for 6 years in 2 portfolios. One is higher education, universities and colleges and training, and the other one was research, innovation, and science. And I am glad to say that, Garnet, since I did began my journey in politics, many Iranians, they also follow suit, and now we have 4 actually MPs from 2 MPs and 2 MPPs from Iranian descent serving our in our legislatures and parliament. And also there are many people who participate in the elections, both provincial, federal, and municipal as a candidate. And of course, many of them, they go out and vote and participate in our democratic process by one way or another. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, the Iranian community is so active in Canadian domestic politics as well as in promoting freedom and democracy in Iran. We've seen just incredible numbers of people. I think 50,000 at one recent rally. So thank you both of you for sharing your background and your story. But just before we get to the current events, my sort of journey of awareness around Iran, I recall basically it starting in I think it was 2009. There was a big protest movement then early on in President Obama's tenure in office. And I think that was the first time for me, as someone who's more politically active, really getting the sense that the Iranian people don't want the regime that rules over them, and have shown really incredible courage in taking to the streets. But at the time, there was horrific violence against those protesters, and that protest movement ended. And then successively, including a number of times since I've been a member of parliament, we've seen these kinds of movements. So this seems to be something that happens periodically, where the pain and the outrage manifests itself in sharp protests. But I'm also getting the sense from people I've talked to that something is different now, that it's not just another moment that's similar to those past moments, but something different is happening. So I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on some of those protest movements in recent history, and then how they compare to what's happening now.
Maybe I'll go. I think in terms of scale, this is probably the biggest one that we have ever had. And when I was thinking about it and comparing it to the protests that we had in 2009, and that was in relation to an election, and I put that in quotation marks because we don't have free elections in Iran. It was an election where the reformist president did not win the election, and people were extremely unhappy about that, and they took to the street, and it was huge. But the difference, I think there were quite a few differences. One was that the protests were mostly in the major cities. They were not widespread, and they were certainly not in smaller areas. And another difference was that you could still see a little bit of religious connotation in some of the protests and some of the slogans. For example, people would go onto their rooftops early in the morning or at night, and they would say Allahu Akbar, which means God is great. And that was something that was happening throughout the big cities, and it was part of the protests that people were saying this, but it had a religious connotation to it. Not all of the slogans had that, but that one, it really stood out to me at least. And we don't see that anymore. That has completely gone. Any kind of religious connotation is absolutely gone now. The protest right now is very, very secular. And we can see that in the symbol of oppression for Iranian women, which is the mandatory hijab. And that's the first thing that has gone. And the protests were sparked because of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old girl who didn't have her hijab done properly, again, in quotation marks. And she was killed while she was in custody because of her hijab. And so now we're seeing all these women, and it's not just women in their 20s and 30s like we've seen previously. We're seeing little girls, 13, 14, 15, young girls at schools, and I'm getting emotional just talking about it. But they're taking off their hijab in school, knowing the risk. They're painting over Khomeini's pictures in school. They're putting up pictures of Mahsa Amini. It's just incredible how widespread it is now in terms of age alone. We're seeing older women that have worn the hijab all their lives, 80-year-old, 70-year-old women taking off the hijab and saying this is in support of the women who are going outside, and they're cutting off their hair. So I think that it's just the range, the enormousness of it, and the fact that it's not just one age group, it's everyone. It's the young, it's the old, it's everyone. And while women have been absolutely in the forefront, the men have also been supportive and right there along with the women supporting them. And I think it's been incredible. And that's the difference that I see now versus before.
Yeah. And I think that is an important point about the men participating as well, because obviously these are women led, and that's something to celebrate. But I think some of the commentary in the West has created the impression that maybe it's the women alone, and that's maybe a little bit more of a would be that it's sort of divided that way. But no, it's women leading, but men are involved.
They're right
supporting.
there.
Yeah.
They're very much involved. I mean, you can see all in the videos. They're right there supporting the women. If women are getting attacked, they're right there defending the women. It's very unified. It's everyone together.
Yeah. Reza, your take on this, comparing kind of the current moment to some of the other protests that we've seen.
Well, first of all, Garth, I must tell you that, the protest or the revolution, as they say now, is happening in Iran, is not something new. I mean, since this regime came into office in 1979, people started protesting against the regime in very many occasions. Whenever they had a chance, they protested. And of course, the 2009 protest, which was known as Green Movement, was the biggest since that time. And of course, since then, there has been also very many protests. But this one is unique, as Sayeh said, this is unique. I think one of the uniqueness of this current protest or revolution which is happening is that it is continuous. It has been now close to 40 days. Or even more than 40 days now. So it is not just only 1 or 2 days, it's 40 days. The second characteristic is that this revolution now doesn't have a particular leader. They are not gathering in one location and protesting. In almost in every city, they are protesting in different streets, different areas, and without any leadership really. But they have their own leaders, of course, on the ground, but not one unified leader. And the other characteristics, as Sayeh said, it is purely a secular movement, and the men, women, children, even children, school children, high school children, elementary school children, they are also involved in this in this movement, in this protest. So in terms of its characteristics, it is very, very unique. Maybe it is unique in the world, actually. It has started, as you mentioned, by killing of Gina Amini, Gina Amini, Mahsa Amini. But that was a kind of trigger, because they have killed so many Mahsa Aminis in the past. And since then also they have killed at least 200-300 people, and how many hundreds of people they have, thousands of people they have wounded and imprisoned. But that particular point, I think, acted in a way that the society was just in the verge of explosion, and the whole country exploded at one point. And since then, the regime tried to divert people's attention to foreign forces or foreigners, saying this is the doing of the Americans or the Israelis. That didn't work. And then they tried to create some conflict in the Kurdish region of Iran. That didn't work. And now they are trying to create a conflict between in our borders with the Republic of Azerbaijan. And now they are trying to create a conflict over there in order to divert the attention of the public in Iran to some foreign sources. But I think people of Iran, they are now very, very well versed. They know what's happening, they know what they are doing, and they know what they want and what they don't want. I think clearly they don't want this regime. This is the message they are sending to the world leaders. And I hope our leaders in Canada also hear this very message of the Iranian people, that these people, very vividly, they are saying that we don't want this regime. So that, foreign countries, the US, Canada, and other countries, they should really modify their policies with regard to Iran and try to support the Iranian people rather than, communicating with other countries. I am so pleased, and for that matter, I congratulate you, Garnet, and your party when you were in government. Former Prime Minister Harper, severed the diplomatic relationship with this brutal regime in Iran, and Canada became the first country in the world to do that. And we are so proud as Canadians from our government. And I said this a couple of times, that I expressed my sincere thanks to Prime Minister Harper for doing that. So I think other countries should follow suit, and that is the time to do it.
Mm-hmm. So many great points there to pick up on. I'd like to probe this issue of, in terms of revolution, in terms of not wanting the regime, probe a little bit the issue of how that could unfold. We've seen some instances where there's massive protest movements, and eventually then, maybe the military is ordered to fire on civilians, the military refuses, and then the regime goes. So I'm thinking kind of early Arab Spring, Tunisia, Egypt, where it was a little bit quicker, let's say. Then you had other cases like Libya or like Syria, where notwithstanding a significant groundswell of opposition, the regimes dug in and refused to give in to that popular will, and therefore battle lines were drawn. It became a civil war instead of a revolution. It may not be a strict binary between those things, but what do you think is more realistic for Iran in terms of what could unfold to get us from where we are now to the future we all hope for with a free and democratic Iran?
I think, Arif, this revolution which is happening in Iran is very different than Arab Spring in its character, it's in its nature, and also this is in fact the third revolution Iranians are having in the past 100 years. This is the third one. So I think this revolution is going to succeed to establish a democratic government in Iran. Now, how this is going to unfold, of course, it's we can't say exactly how it's going to unfold, but I think there are signs that the regime is going to collapse from inside. More or less the same process happened in the Soviet Union. I think it may end up in such a direction. And in Iran, of course, military will be one decisive factor, but I think the second one will be the religious establishment. I mean, those ayatollahs and those religious people there, for their own future, if some of those, the grand ayatollahs, if they come out and pull out their support from the regime, I think that also will discredit the regime and will weaken the regime greatly. And this may also happen because those people, they are going, they are saying, we hear some of them commenting, saying that, if the regime goes, we will be dead. So for their own survival, they may come out and do that. So that also may happen. But I think my own feeling is that this regime is going to collapse from inside. Another major characteristics of this sort of revolution in Iran is that not only men, women, children, students, they are together, but in terms of various ethnicities in Iran, they're also together. The regime tried to send out the message that, the Kurds in Iran, they are separatists, or Balochis are separatists, and the Turks are separatists, and others. But they start sending the messages that we love each other. So that's what's happening. So people are united from various ethnic backgrounds and from various geographic of Iran. They're all protesting in every. I've heard that there are maybe 1,000 protests going on every day in different locations in different cities. So that is a very unique characteristic. I think what's happening in Iran now, from uprising point of view, is quite new, and I'm sure the sociologists and politicians in the future, or political analysts, I should say, they will be analyzing the character of this movement which is going on there.
Yeah, I'll go to you, Sayeh, in a second, but I did want to just do one quick follow-up on a point you were making. You were talking about the regime collapsing from within. You talked about the religious establishment, but can I probe the military side of this a little bit? In Egypt, for example, the military had kind of a separate personality from the regime, and during the Arab Spring period, and I agree, many differences in terms of those movements, but that was a case where the military, as a somewhat separate institution from the regime, said no to carrying out its wishes. I mean, in the case of Iran, we talk a lot about the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is very much an organ of the regime. And it's something I don't understand well in terms of the institution. So is there the IRGC and then a separate Iranian army? Is there the possibility that the army would oppose the IRGC, or that the IRGC would go a different direction from the leaders? I mean, how does this dynamic work out institutionally in terms of where the coming apart could be?
Well, in Egypt, as you said, the army was the military of Egypt, not the army of the president.
Right.
So this is in contrast to what we had during the Shah's time in Iran. Our military was called Imperial Army or Imperial Military. So it basically related to the king. But in Egypt, the army was an army of the country, of the nation. The same thing in Turkey, for example. Again, the army is the country's military. So with this current regime, the IRGC and also the regular army, they are practically the arms of the regime. Even sometimes people distinguish between the regular army and IRGC. Now they are controlled by the same government after 43 years. I mean, the current regular army of Iran is not the regular army we had 43 years ago. It's all controlled by the regime. They're all their own people under a different name, I think. If it was otherwise, they could have acted by now, after 40 days of the brutal killing and suppressing the public. So I think what will going to happen is that, or may happen, is that if this things continue for some time, some elements within IRGC and the army, they may leave the government or become, they become towards maybe the people, and then somehow this IRGC structure may start weakening, and at that point, and also if the Grand Ayatollah then they come out and also pull out their support from the regime, from Khamenei, then they all may help each other, and then that leads to some kind of collapse of the regime. But this is just one of the scenarios, of course.
Yeah. Sayeh, I'd love to hear you pick up on any of those points, but I'm also curious to drill down onto the leaderless dimension of the protests and what implications that would have for a prospective transition. I mean, in terms of the current movement, how is it all kind of coming together on the opposition side, and are there different elements with different views on what the future of Iran should be, or is it very united? And what are your thoughts on how this process could unfold?
I think it's hard to predict at this point, but for sure, I think what we see now is that there's no going back. This has been going on now for a month and a half, and it's just too big. The government has not been able to crush it the way that they have been able to do the previous protests. People have they're not discouraged, they're not scared, they're in the streets. And maybe I shouldn't say they're not scared, because they probably are very scared. It takes a lot of courage to do what they're doing right now, but they're there, they're risking it all for freedom. And I think, so there's no going back. But in terms of what the future holds, it's hard to tell, but this is my personal opinion, because I've never been part of we have a lot of different political organizations outside of the country, and I've never been part of any of those, because it's my belief that people in Iran should and are able to choose the path that they want to choose, and it's going to be up to them. And I think they have the intelligence, they have the capability to make the decision of what kind of government do they want. They've made it very clear they want a secular government. I think that's amply clear. That's what they're looking for. But what kind of government are they looking for? What kind of leadership? It's going to be up to the Iranians to decide, not to the foreign governments. And I think us living in Canada and in other countries, to some extent, we all have our opinions, but it's really the Iranian people who are risking their lives, and they're the ones that have to decide. I know it's very difficult when you're inside the country to have leadership, because all the leaders, as we know, they're arrested and they're tortured and they're executed. And we have so many political activists that are in prison right now as well. But I believe that the people in Iran should and can and have the capability to choose their leadership. I think what we do need from from the Western countries and the free world is really support in terms of stop legitimizing the Islamic regime, both politically and economically. That's really what we need, what the Iranians need from the Western world, because that is what's going to help the revolution, as Mr. Moridi puts it, and I believe that this is the start of a revolution that's going on in Iran right now. So that's really what we need, is stop legitimizing this regime and let the Iranian people choose their path and their future and a secular government for themselves.
Lots of really important points there. Thank you. And it's, I think, a good jumping off point then for saying, okay, what are those policies that we should be undertaking here in Canada? Some people might ask, does it matter? Can we actually half a world away say or do things as parliamentarians, as average citizens in the lawmaking process that make a difference? And what would those things be? Sayeh, do you want to kick us off on this point as well?
Sure. I think it absolutely makes a difference on two different levels. First of all, people are on the street and the regime wants to make them believe that they're alone, that nobody's watching, that nobody cares, and that they can be killed and tortured and raped, and that's not a problem. So when we see people like yourself, James Bazan, other parliamentaries who are coming out and they're condemning these actions, people in Iran see this and they see, okay, we're not alone. There are politicians, there are other people who care, who are being our voice right now. And that gives them further courage to go outside and do what they're doing because they know that they're not alone. And that's important on that level. And then the second level, I think this is the first time that I have seen the current liberal government ever, even in word, condemn what is happening in Iran. I've never heard the prime minister ever condemn the Iranian Islamic regime before. And I think that's a good step. It's the first step. It's not by any means, all that needs to be done. Words are good, but without actions, obviously they are not effective. And we need this government. Yes, they've now condemned what's going on in Iran. I think that's good. They have now said that, part of the Revolutionary Guards are going to be inadmissible from coming to Canada. It's going to be in the Immigration Act. That's good. I think those are all positive steps. But it leaves me with some questions. For example, why are we not putting them, the entirety of the organization, not just few select people, why are we not putting them in the criminal code? Where there's actually, put them in the criminal code as a terrorist organization. That way there is concrete, real consequences for them and for anybody that associates with them. Why are we not doing that? And then what are we doing with everybody that's already here? Because we know, and we Iranian Canadians have been saying for years now, that the regime affiliates, agents, Revolutionary Guards are here in Canada, investing their money, spying on Canadians, Iranian Canadian activists, threatening people, intimidating people. What is the government going to do about these people? Are they going to be returned back to Iran? Are they going to be identified? What steps are going to be taken? And then in terms of the sanctions on these particular individuals that have been named, most of these people don't have their assets under their own name. They have it under the families and, close people. Are they going to look into that? What's going to happen with all of those monies and those investments which have been stolen from the Iranian people and brought to Canada? So those are some questions that have been raised for me, and I'm hoping the government will be able to answer.
Yeah, to put a fine point on it, I mean, I have been hearing since I was first elected from, and it's not just the Iranian community, but it's a big issue for the Iranian community, this sense that regime figures steal money from people and launder it here in Canada. They bring it here and they enjoy the free lives that they deny to people back in Iran. And this is a major point of agitation. I want to come back to it. But just on the issue of sanctions and actions, Reza, I know you're a very multi-party sort of guy. You've got good friends in all parties, and you're widely respected across the spectrum. But you were elected as a liberal, and so I would imagine you have a lot of particular connections and relationships with people in in the current government. How do you evaluate their performance kind of over time, but also currently in terms of some of the actions that Sayeh talked about needing to be taken to support the people of Iran?
Well, I think generally speaking, our government's action over the past 5 weeks has been good. I think people are happy that the government took the action in terms of sanctioning 10,000 leaders of the IRGC and the Iranian regime, and also enacting on the Magnitsky law. So these are some of the actions they are taking. But of course, the expectation was that the IRGC be put to on the list of terrorist organizations. That is the legislation actually you brought to the parliament, Gardner, 4 years ago, and the prime minister was the first person, being liberal and the leader of the Liberal Party at that time, and still he is now, but he was the first person to stand up and vote for your motion. But I think going back to your previous question, our country, Canada, Garnet, under Prime Minister Mulroney, was the leader in the question of South Africa. This goes back to 1990. I remember I was new in Canada in those days, but I knew very well that Prime Minister Mulroney was the key person in liberating, one of the key person at least, in liberating South Africa from that brutal apartheid regime. And he's the one who took the leadership. I think our government can do the same thing now because Canada has that history. So we should be really taking that lead. I mean, again, our country, Canada, is the first country in the world with severe diplomatic relationship with Iran. Now, a petition going out in the internet, this morning I looked at over 500,000 people signed this petition asking G7 countries to expel Iranian ambassadors diplomats from their countries. So Canada did this under Prime Minister Harper several years ago. So we have that history. So why not to use that, to follow that tradition in this country? Our current government should be doing this. The message Iranian people has sent to the world that we do not want this regime. We want this regime to be changed. But how can they do it? I mean, they need the world's help. And now they are facing with a brutal regime with its military forces under different names, but they are all IRGC, but they're under different names. There are different factions, different groups. So they are basically fighting with nothing in their hand. So it is now for Canada, as Prime Minister Mulroney did. I heard the story that he went to President Reagan and they said, we need to bring this to the end. And they did. And they helped, the Mandela and the other freedom fighters in South Africa, and the transition happened. I mean, back to your previous question again, if such an initiative is implemented by Canada, it could be, transition, one scenario for transition from this regime to the democratic regime in the future could be through negotiations. I mean, if this regime sees that the world community, they are backing up, they are not with them anymore, and that is the demand from the world community that leave the power to the people of the country. So they may start leaving the government by negotiations.
Yeah, I appreciate your assessment. I'll kind of put to you my assessment of kind of the liberal government's trajectory, and the hat I wear, everybody does, but it seems to me that there's been a significant trajectory in the government's tone on this over the last 7 years. They came into power in 2015 opposing what conservatives had done. They came into power in 2015 saying that they wanted to reopen the embassy in Iran, and there were events that really shifted the public attention, various human rights abuses that were kind of in the foreground when we had the opposition motion to list the IRGC as a terrorist organization, and the Liberals voted for it. So that was one kind of step, but they never implemented it. And then they still failed to list anybody under the Magnitsky Act up until recently. There was, and it's not even clear what sanctions instrument they're using now, but up until recently, certainly nobody was listed in Iran under the Magnitsky Act. And it seemed like, but then, 2 years ago, there was the downing of flight PS752, and that was another issue where there was pressure from the Canadian public. The Canadian government didn't react enough, in my view. And now there's so much mounting public pressure within the Iranian community and elsewhere that we now see the announcement of additional sanctions that are still quite late in the process and are still not enough. So in a way, you could say that's a positive trajectory in that the Liberal government certainly is not saying the same things today that they said in 2015. But on the other hand, they've been behind in a chronological sense and in terms of taking the action that's required. And my concern is that if this issue isn't in the news as much, and it's inevitable really that things that take time stop being covered in the media at some point, that we'll see a reduction in action. Is that a description of the trajectory? Do you think it's overly partisan, or do you think it's fair? Maybe Reza, quick response, and then I'll go to you, Sayeh, for your assessment after that.
I don't think it's a partisan guard. This is basically the chronological events happened over the past 7 years, and now we are quite I mean, people are somehow happy that government took actions, and that is, I mean, it was late. It should have been much earlier than this, but still something they have taken some action. But I think this is not enough at all. I think they should do more. They should come up very shortly. First of all, they could cancel the super visas of regime elements, either themselves and their relatives living in Canada, and those have been, their children are students in our universities, and the others as well. So they have their relatives, their permanent residence in Canada. I mean, these are. I'm pretty sure that Immigration Canada, they have a list of their relatives. They should act quickly on that. They shouldn't be waiting for 2 years or 3 years or even months. They could do it in days and weeks, and they should do that. I mean, just saying that we're going to sanction 10,000 people, that's not adequate. Who are those 10,000 people, and what do they mean by sanctions? So it has to have some teeth. Yeah,
I do notice this as well, like in the Ukraine context as well. Part of the rhetoric of the government is they're always adding more sanctions. But there's an infinite number of sanctions you can add by upping the restriction on this person and the question is, are we doing a large enough volume in the right areas that's going to have the decisive impact? Sayeh, what's your kind of evaluation of the Canadian government's response on some of these key issues that we've agreed are important?
I think it's unfortunate that it has taken the murder of so many innocent people for these even small changes to be brought about. And again, they're positive changes, but why did it have to take the murder of so many people for this to, for the Prime Minister to even condemn what is going on? What is taking so long? And it's also concerning to me that the Prime Minister hasn't gone to a single rally to speak to any of the Iranian Canadians to see what do they want, what their concerns are. I mean, we've seen the Prime Minister attend other rallies in the height of COVID, and yet for whatever reason, he's chosen not to attend these rallies. And that's concerning to me as an Iranian Canadian. Why is he not attending? Why is he not speaking to the Iranian Canadians? So those are two of my concerns. And I think, again, words are good, but we need action. We are not seeing the kind of action that we should. And I'm really glad that we have people like you, like James Bazan, who, our the new conservative leader, Mr. Poilievre, who are very active and outspoken about this on the parliament. I think that's what's going to keep the government on its toes, and it's going to not, let this die down when the media stops covering it.
Yeah, we need to be persistent in bringing these issues up, and certainly we will. Any thoughts on the other parties? Bloc, NDP. I've noticed the NDP as well. I think sometimes because of the sort of the women's rights dimension of this, you see lately maybe parties of the left getting more engaged than they've been in the past because they really like the idea of a women-led movement. But some of that is actually dissonant with their own histories. Like the NDP voted against listing the IRGC as a terrorist organization, and it's still not entirely clear to me where they stand. Do either of you have thoughts on what we're seeing from some of the other parties on this?
It's not clear to me where they stand either, but I think, as you said, you would expect the parties in the left to be supportive of women's rights and what's going on. And I haven't really seen anything and that's why I'm confused, because I haven't seen the leaders come out and really take any strong stance against this. And like you said, they voted in the past against, putting the Revolutionary Corps, listing them as a terrorist organization. And I would expect at this moment, seeing what's happening in Iran and how women are in the forefront, that it would be the parties in the left that would actually be leading this movement and helping the Iranian people, not necessarily the conservative party, which to me, it's a little bit interesting to see that the roles have been reversed in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we have a long tradition as a conservative party of human rights advocacy, and also a level of realism when it comes to security, and I think that's, what the accusation we make to the other parties is that they're very interested in the image, but that they don't have the substance to back it up. Go ahead, Reza, you were going to chime in on that.
Yes, I was going to say that, NDP in the past was a little different than NDP in the past few years. In 1980, the resolution or the motion to proclaim the massacre of 1988 in the Iranian prisons by the order of Khomeini, the first supreme leader of Iran, was considered by the House of Commons as a crime against humanity. That was a motion put forward by the NDP, and of course supported by both Conservative Party and Liberal Party, but the initiative came from the NDP. But since then, NDP has changed a little direction. In the past few days, when there was a big rally in Vancouver, I was there. I saw Jack Missing in Vancouver among the people who were demonstrating on the streets there. So he was there, but I think that is not adequate. I think the move which recently our Prime Minister and also Deputy Prime Minister Christopher Freeland explicitly came out and called the Iranian regime as terrorist regime. I think that is a pretty strong statement. And we would like all politicians really come out and make similar statements, but not only on the statement side, Garnet. I think we should take, as a country, we should take a very succinct steps. The same thing, as I said, our former Prime Minister Mahrouni did in relation to South Africa. And Canada is very well positioned to take the leadership on the human rights issues in Iran, and also help the Iranian people to achieve their goal, which is getting rid of this brutal regime and establishing a democracy there. The same thing Canada did, as I said, in the South African case. I think this is a time for our leaders to give some serious thought to that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree with you about the aspiration for serious Canadian leadership. I think it's I don't know. I think frankly, the government will on that is a big question. But yeah, look, these are really important issues, and I think Canada has some unique competences that we could bring to the table. But I think it seems to me we've been perceived as actually a country of safe haven for friends of the regime, and that has maybe negatively affected our perception in terms of our ability to engage on this. Let's talk in the final few minutes we have about that issue. Both of you have mentioned, and we've talked about it in other contexts, kind of this issue of money laundering, but also of threats and intimidation. It's incredible to me that even family members of those killed in flight PS752, shot down by the IRGC, have faced intimidation here in Canada for speaking out. How big a problem is this of people who oppose the regime being threatened or having family members threatened? And what do you think we can do about that piece of it?
It's a pretty big problem. I mean, this is something that I've raised many times. I'm sure, I don't know if Mr. Moridi has, but a lot of Iranian Canadians have this concern. I can give you an example. My husband, for example, he does TV shows and he interviews activists in Iran, and he's very well known, and he's gotten some problems with, weird messages and emails and just things that he's felt like is threatening to him, and he's always concerned about his own safety and my safety. And So it's a concern, and we've raised this for so many years, and it's shocking to me that the government has never really taken, at least that's my perception, that the government has never taken that issue seriously. I've never seen any steps being taken to try to address this. And that's why I mentioned, when they're putting some of these Revolutionary Corps, the specific individuals, they're making them inadmissible. What are they doing about people that are already here? What I really want to know is what steps is the government going to take about people that are already here, threatening the safety of Iranian Canadians who are voicing their concerns about the situation in Iran.
Yeah. Reza, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I'm just following Sayeh's comments. I think some of the, we know that many of elements of Iranian regime, they are living in Canada in various cities, and they are active in various sectors of the society, in economy, and, they're just living in this country, in Vancouver, in Toronto. They have purchased very, very expensive houses, and they're here, they're organizing religious events on the streets of Toronto. And this is the kind of threat to to Canadians, in particular Canadian from the Iranian background. And we saw this in the Ashura celebration or Ashura event on the streets in Toronto and down the street. And one person came and actually threatened a group of people. So these things are happening, and it's rather unfortunate because in the past our immigration law has been a little relaxed in terms of opening doors for those people coming to this country. And I hear from many people, I'm sure Sayeh has done too, people are saying, Iranians saying, well, we escaped from these people, from our homeland, and we came to Canada. Now they are here in Canada. So where should we be, what should be escaping next? The level of threat has been increased to this level that people are even using that sort of expression. So this is the reality, and I think our government needs to take very decisive actions, particularly now with these, the new announcements about the sanctions, Magnitsky Law, and all of that. So they should control these situations. Otherwise, it will be out of hand in the near future if things goes like this.
Any final thoughts you want to share before we wrap up? I'll say one other thing that as someone working in politics, I'm just always inspired by the courage of people that are fighting for their freedom and involved in political activism in a context where they could lose their lives in a moment because of the stand they're taking. We have it so comparatively easy in politics and activism here in Canada. Any final thoughts, calls to action, suggestions, or words of wisdom from either of you? Maybe this time we'll go Reza first, and then Sayeh, you can have the last word.
Yeah, well, thank you again, Garnet, for having this podcast with me, and it was a great delight to be in the company of Sayeh. Well, my request and my thought would be, again, for our leaders in our country, Canada, that keep a close eye on what's happening in Iran. And if we bring democracy to Iran, we could solve various problems of the world, in particular in the Middle East, because this regime in Iran is the source of so many conflicts, so many atrocities in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in various other parts of the region as well, and in the world as well. I mean, see how many executions, how many terrorist actions they have done in Europe or in the US and other countries. So by removing this regime from the Iranian government and bringing a democracy there, we are going not only to solve the problem of Iranian people, but also many people in the region and worldwide too.
Yeah, that's a great point. And even Ukraine, right? I mean, we're seeing some news lately about Iranian technology on the Russian side. They're targeting, sadly, civilians. Yeah, that's a very important point, and I think it's not just in Iran. The Iranian people are in a way in the front lines of this fight against a regime that is threatening all of us, but in particular that is fomenting conflict and violence in other regions. It's an incredibly hopeful thought. What would the Middle East look like with a democratic Iran at the heart of it? Sayeh, go ahead. Final word for you.
Yeah, just picking up on what Mr. Moridi was saying, I think it's really important for us Canadians to realize that the regime is not just a threat to the Iranians in Iran. They are a threat to everyone, really. They've been funding terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah for so many years, and now they're involved in the Ukraine-Russia war. And they're building nuclear weapons. So it's not just the Iranian people that are in danger, it's everyone. And it's in the best interest of Western governments to stop it when they can. And I'm very hopeful that your party is going to continue what you've been doing and putting pressure on the government to make sure that the steps, the concrete steps that we need to help the Iranian people, they take place. And I'm very thankful for you and for everything that you've been doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you to both of you for coming on this podcast again, but more importantly for the work that you are doing. That's a wrap for today. Thank you everybody for listening. We're doing episodes every 2 weeks this fall, and bringing you stories from here in Canada and around the world. Stories of conflict, of injustice, but also of the ability of people to fight back against injustice with immense courage. So thank you for listening. Please share this episode with your family and friends on social media, and consider leaving a review for us. And we'll be back again with more Resuming Debate 2 weeks from now.